Welcome to the Biz Bros podcast. My name is Kyle Nelson, and I have my co-host here, Mr. Eli Libby. And today we have another awesome episode of the podcast, another great guest that's really going to be offering some great insight into podcasting and kind of how to start one, launch one, grow one, and all the tactics that you need to get started. We have Roger Naran, the CEO and founder of Jar Audio. Jar Audio works with some very cool leading brands out there like RBC, Royal Bank, Lululemon, Expedia, BBC Storyworks, and so many others. So we're excited to have him on here, and it's an honor. Welcome, Roger.
Thanks so much, guys. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as we kick things off, tell our listeners a little bit more about your background before we dive into the kind of meat of the topic.
Yeah, so I've spent the last 20 years in the advertising world, working as a client service lead for big agencies, most notably DDB. And then I also worked for Cossette, which is one of the best agencies in Canada. Worked for some sponsorship agencies as well as some sort of smaller mid-tier advertising and design agencies.
Yeah.
Nice.
Awesome. Wow.
So what got you? So I'm guessing all the agency work kind of, once the podcasting world kind of started picking up and there were some pioneers out there, is that kind of when you got started with podcasting, or was there something that happened that kind of propelled you into that sector?
Yeah, so I was doing some podcasts on my own, just as a hobby. I always like to say that I was using podcasts as an excuse to meet really interesting people and learn from them. So I had a few hobby podcasts of my own, and met a couple individuals up here in Vancouver. We're in Vancouver, Canada, and went out for beer one night and started banging around the idea of starting a business using all of our talents. And so, me from my marketing side, my partner Jen from her journalism side. She comes from CBC, which is Canada's version of NPR, and then my other partner at the time, Aaron Johnson, came from many years in the broadcast world. So, we decided to give the company a shot. So made the leap.
Awesome. Yeah, podcasting is definitely the future and kind of where it's going. What do you see about podcasting that intrigues you so much in terms of maybe the longevity of podcasting?
It's like everyone talks about like video marketing.
Yeah.
Now it's podcasting. I mean, Clubhouse is a perfect example. Everything's turning audio. Went like audio, video, now it's audio again.
Yeah. Why do you think that is happening, and why do you think audio is such a big trend?
Yeah.
And why is it going to stick around for so long?
So I think it's such a big trend because of the intimacy of the medium. So, right now, as listeners are listening to this, it's literally in their ear, and they're spending time with the content versus something being broadcast to them. And I mean, I know we're slowly fading away from broadcast. We see a lot less radio, a lot less TV, more streaming, more sort of what I would call pull mediums. But podcasting is portable, it's mobile. It's an opportunity for somebody to really engage with content on their own time. There's no appointment viewing. It's no appointment listening. It's all up to them and their experience. And I think just the ability to tell great stories and in an engaging, emotional, funny, knowledge-filled way is really catching on. And then there's the niche topics that anybody can really dig into, no matter what your interest.
Yeah, I think what I like about podcasting, and I think why it's so like trending even more, everyone's doing it, everybody's listening to it, is two things. I think it's very passive. You don't need to be 100% focused like with video or reading. You have to be focused. Where you can work at any time. You could be on a commute. Anytime you could just listen, and it's just so digestible.
It is.
It's kind of like growing up. I always remember my dad always had these books on tape we'd listen to in his truck. As we were cruising like to a baseball game, we go to the baseball game. It's like it was passive. It was something that me and him could do together, outside of conversation. So I think I think over time it's like podcasting's kind of starting to replace that as well.
I agree. I think what we like from a business standpoint, or really not even business, but just personal standpoint, is that podcasts live forever.
Yeah,
they have the opportunity to have a really long lifespan versus like an Instagram story. You're gone pretty quick, but the lifespan of podcasts is always going to be there. You can always reference that content. I think that's what I love.
You never know it's going to rank. You never know when someone's going to pick it up.
It's true.
And Kyle, you were just talking about, sort of active versus passive. the majority of podcast listeners are doing other things while they're listening to podcasts. They're washing the dishes, they're mowing the lawn, they're going for a walk. And actually, there's a really cool study that was put out by the BBC that says that when they are listening, from a marketing perspective, when they are listening, and then they happen to hear marketing messages, it actually enters the subconscious a lot more easier than other forms of marketing messages, which is sort of the antithesis of everything we've ever known about, the clutter in the market space and just so many messages flying your way. But when you actually listen and learn at the same time while doing other things, they call it low. They call what do they call a low fuel load, sort of low fuel involvement or whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think about when you're watching TV, you get a commercial, change the channel, like you don't even pay attention to it, or even like YouTube, if you or whatever, and you get like an ad real quick. It's so easy to grab your phone and just like, okay, I'm gonna ignore this for 15 seconds. But it's right. Podcasting, you're kind of forced to listen to it. Yeah, and you're like, actively like in it.
And why brand, one of the other reasons brands get so excited and one of the reasons we've had success is the engagement level of listening to a podcast is through the roof compared to other mediums like video, for example. I mean, our shows are getting about a 95% listen through rate on a 20 to 30 minute episode. And that's coming from a brand. Like that's pretty impressive. Yeah. And now keep in mind that our shows are not advertisements. You're not listening to a show all about, Expedia or all about Lululemon. It's a value pack show that happens to be either solving a problem or hitting some sort of solution that the listener is looking for, or could be something just purely entertaining. If they need a laugh or they need a cry, it just happens to be brought to you by Expedia or Lululemon, and is tied in nicely with the brand values.
That's really cool.
So if we do our job right as podcasters, we put out a good show with high production quality that's consistent, that really is audience focused and centered on what their needs are. They should subscribe and they should be demanding more, which as a marketer you really can't ask for anything else.
Absolutely. What was the effect of COVID? I read a couple studies that because of people not commuting as much, podcast listens went down. Did you see that happen? Or
so sort of March, April, we saw a significant dip because commuting stopped. I think also just so many people clamored for news, breaking news. And so we did see a dip. But then about May, June, everything climbed back up and actually exceeded what the industry was expecting from a listener standpoint. And it's actually just continued to rise. Tomorrow, the big sort of annual listener survey comes out, which is put out every year by Edison Research, and they'll give the newest update on what listens are like and what the listener behavior is looking like. So I think that's the sort of headline of what happened was the behavior changed. So people went a lot more onto desktop. They started listening, streaming more because they were tethered into their their internet, or they had just easy access to Wi-Fi. So at the end of the day, people still needed a break. People still needed to learn things. I'm one of those people that's capable of writing a blog post while listening to a podcast episode. Some people aren't, but I am, or I'm able to pound out a bunch of emails and things like that. And so people's behavior changed, which is really interesting to see. And I think through everything from Black Lives Matter and the summer, everything kind of shifted. Things started shifting from a content perspective. The conversation became a little bit more focused on that, which is important. And then throughout the year we saw ebbs and flows of different types of focus and conversation. But for the most part, the listening just continued to increase.
Absolutely. Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I can definitely see the trend. It makes sense.
It makes total sense.
Our listens have gone up too, which is cool. So let's kind of dive in. Why? So from you guys' perspective, what do you guys kind of pitch to brands? What's the value prop of having a brand have a podcast? Like, where is it?
Yeah.
Thinking or having a way to communicate with your followers. What's your guys' big value prop for that?
So we really emphasize the idea of owning your audience, and so as being a recovering marketer myself, I knew that one of the challenges that my clients always had was keeping their funnel full. They had no problem getting people into the funnel. It was just constantly leaking. Either they were disappointing somebody along the way, they were losing them in some sort of fashion because of competition, or they just get busy and lose focus. And so you're constantly having to refill that funnel, which is expensive and time consuming. But if you can deliver, really engaging content that is subscribable, and which is the beautiful thing about podcasting is the actual habit of subscribing is baked into the nature of podcasts. And I'll talk about something interesting with that in a sec. And so, if you can latch on to people and reach them with really great content that they want to hear or see more of, then that keeps your funnel a lot more full. And so it actually lowers your cost of acquisition because you're getting more word of mouth and shares and all that. And so we really talk about the idea of owning your audience versus renting your audience, which is what's happening a lot when you're investing in programmatic advertising. And I'm not saying that doesn't work, and there are reasons to do that, but it's very much kind of like short-term gain versus long-term. And so podcasts are just like the film industry, is a fantastic way to build an audience. Plus, the podcast listener is quite unique. And so if you have a brand that is trying to attract a certain audience, a little bit more affluent, loves to learn, college educated, small families, loves to spend a little bit more money on themselves. Like, there's a whole range of different things that describe a typical podcast listener. Another fantastic way to get in there. Also, I think as the cookie conversation starts to get a little bit more serious, and we start to potentially see signs of not being able to have all that third-party data that we've kind of become addicted to. Again, it puts way more importance on the idea of owning your audience and giving them a reason to stay sort of within your garden, versus the other, where they're just sort of coming and going. It's sort of like shopping in the shopping mall versus poking your head in the door every once in a while.
Totally. It relates, very closely to the e-commerce world. People are renting marketplaces like an Amazon, but they're not owning that customer. Whereas everybody's trying to pull them back into their own website so that they can own that customer, get a little bit more lifetime value out of them as well.
Totally.
Another point that I think was fascinating, what you brought up, is the audience and demographics of podcast listeners. I think that is fascinating. And I think it shows the dedication to a brand as a listener. If I'm going to go, it's like omni-channel experience. If I buy Lululemons, if I shop there, if I go online, if I engage them on social, you are a very
living and breathing the brand.
Living and breathing if you listen to their podcasts. I think.
But as a brand, you have to also respect that fact that the audience is different, and they're more discerning. And we always talk to brands that starting a podcast, getting listeners, none of our podcasts are ever going to be at the level of audiences the size of Joe Rogan or The Daily, or we'll never ever claim that. We can attract quite a large audience though, but in order to do that, the content has to be great, and we argue that in most cases the content has to be even better than your typical podcast, because audiences are naturally going to have a little bit of skepticism. This is content marketing. So, just like any other form of content marketing, you have to sort of walk the fine balance line between selling and just offering, tons and tons of value. We argue that you shouldn't do any selling at all. You're going to get that sort of brand halo effect by offering really great content that's value focused and zeroed in on the audience. But you got to be careful, and so understanding that audience is important because they're expecting something good.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. It's exciting to see so many brands starting to understand like the cool communication barrier, or I guess bridge that we can have with podcasting. It's cool to like start seeing the brand and the personality behind the actual company. And I think it's what a lot of people like, in order to, get to know the founders or the marketing managers or the frontline workers, whatever it is. Podcasting is allowing us to do that finally, and having kind of a mascot for your company. So I think
it's why we follow companies on Facebook and Instagram. It's why we want to learn more and attend conferences and want to kind of see behind the scenes. It's one of the reasons why blogs took off, is this sort of like peek behind the curtain aspect of it. And that's why, like, we think that services like Clubhouse, for example, are great, and they're gonna stick around. But there is that sort of like fleeting moment aspect to it that you're never going to get the quality of a podcast, which can be sound designed and have proper hosts with proper training, who are going to be able to ask great questions. Like, as much as live is great, which it is right now, being able to edit a show is going to make for an easier sometimes an easier listener experience. And that's actually where professionals like my company, Jar Audio, come in, and why there is value in working with us, because we're able to stitch an episode together and use our experience to get that listen length as long as possible, which as a marketer, that engagement level is really what you're looking for. And so we can actually, apply certain sort of tips and tricks and tools for doing so, to keep the listener engaged.
Yeah. A question I had on that is, to keep the listener engaged, do you do any consulting with the actual podcast hosts in order to help them maybe extend that listen length, giving them tips and tricks and best practices to interview and things like that? Is that something that you guys do?
Well, 9 times out of 10, our hosts are professional hosts that either have voiceover experience or have done this before. So they're going to come to the table with, literally to the table in some cases, with experience in having in interviews. We're also in advance pre-interviewing our guests to pluck the best conversation topics to really pull out the, whether it's something emotional or whether it's something that is, controversial or fascinating, something that, so we're doing that in advance, and we're really highlighting that in our question lines to our, for our hosts. So we're making sure that they're really hitting the things that we think are going to make for the best conversation.
Yeah.
In the cases where we're perhaps, working with somebody from within an organization who hasn't had any experience, yes, we're doing a lot of training with them and really kind of zeroing in on like the importance of asking follow-up questions, and the importance of sort of pivoting from, if you've got a round table, sort of pivoting from one guest to the next and getting their perspective on the same topic, so that the listener is kind of getting a bit of a rounded perspective on the topic. We're trying to encourage them to just take a moment and let a little bit of air kind of in the room, so that you get a little bit of tension, which we can also fix, or we can also extend or tweak in the edit. So there's a number of different things that we're doing.
That's awesome. It's cool to see kind of the process
really cool.
of how you guys kind of pre-interview and really try to grab the questions that are actually going to get a good conversation going.
Yeah, it's interesting, because the challenge becomes trying to, because that takes a lot of time and that's a lot of effort. A lot of work is done before you even get to a microphone.
Right.
And so, part of our job is explaining that process and educating clients, which is really exciting, because I think they're getting to see a lot of clients that I've worked with in the past have a lot of like video experience, because they've been on commercial shoots, or they've, done the odd production here and there, but very few have ever done podcast production, or just interviews. They've done like, voiceover recordings for radio ads and things like that. So they're used to being around a a studio, but to actually make their content something that is a little closer to news or a little bit closer to sort
More
of
like
60
that,
minutes style than
Mhm.
anything
Yeah.
is new for them. So it's really fun to kind of explain why we're doing things this way and why we're trying to ask these sorts of questions. And it's been really, really interesting and fun to be their Sherpa as they
I love
venture off into the
Be their
podcast world.
That's so cool.
So, what are some of the things that you're seeing with when getting started launching a podcast? Because our listeners are a lot of startup founders and in the younger entrepreneurial phase that are thinking about starting podcasts. Of course, what is something that you're seeing is a good tactic to get some initial reach when you're launching? You're putting all this time and effort into it. Maybe 3 or 4 podcast episodes in to really kind of keep up the kind of the momentum and trying to get your voice heard out there.
Yeah. So I think the misconception in the podcast world is that, you're going to spend all this time on the production and then do a little bit of work on the marketing and, it's going to go viral. It's not going to go viral. The reality is actually more the flip side, where you almost have to do more work on the marketing than you do on the production.
Right.
And it's not to say that you shouldn't do a great job of the production, because in a lot of ways, that's your number one marketing tool, is just produce a great show. But you do have to put in the legwork, in order to make the show reach as many ears as possible, or at least give it the best opportunity to reach, as many ears as possible. So I'm not sure how much time we have, but we kind of look at, launching your show and nurturing that audience from sort of a 6 bucket standpoint. Do we have time for me to go into each?
I think so.
Yeah, that'll wrap it up.
That's a good wrap up. Yeah.
Cool. So the first is what we would just call marketing, and that's where you look at your owned channels, social newsletters, your website. Like, what are the spaces that you currently own, and how can you amplify the podcast in those spaces? When it comes to things like social, you're looking at creating content like, little clips, and there's all sorts of great tools available right now. Headliner's a great one, where you can create little audiograms that kind of take clips from the show and put a visual over it, and almost like a waveform video. And so you're really hitting sort of all the areas that you own and making sure that you have a really tight ecosystem around the podcast. The second area is what we would call PR and publicity, and this is where you're acting like some of the major studios, like when they release Marvel, the latest Marvel film. They're putting together a media kit, and media kit is essentially a synopsis of the show, why people should listen, why they should care. And then an overview of who the host is, an overview of some of the guests, who your audience is. Like, just give people an idea of what they should expect if they were to listen to your show. And then you're creating a kit out of this. So maybe you're including some photos of the host. Maybe you're including your artwork from your show. And also, if you have available already, some links to some of your favorite episodes. And then you're brainstorming a really big list of media contacts. And these days, it's never been easier to reach the media. They like to be pitched because they're all competing for stories, and they're constantly under the gun for content. And so we start wide. We look at national media, New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, all that, kind of going as wide as possible. We then narrow it down into sort of closer to the niche of whatever the show is that you have. So if it's a business podcast, then we're reaching out to, Inc. and Forbes and Fast Company and Wired and all those sorts of guys. Yeah. And then we're getting even more narrow and reaching out to podcast, the podcast media. They're, Pod News, Hot Pod, Sounds Profitable, the business of podcasting and all that sort of stuff. So you're hitting the phones, you're hitting email, and you're pitching them. And then the third area is what we would call merchandising. And this is where you're trying to get featured on Apple Podcasts, in the new and noteworthy section, new and notable, or on Spotify or Stitcher, and a lot of people think that you have to beat some sort of algorithm to get featured there. The reality is that those are all editorial decisions. There's actual, there's a floor of people in California whose job it is to just make those decisions at Apple. So that means you can pitch them. So their information is available online. You can pitch them on why your show should be featured. Now, your show could be featured because it's brand new and it's awesome and great guests and production quality and all that sort of stuff. Or maybe there's a reason you should be featured that's more kind of theme based, like it's summer and people are going to start traveling again. My podcast is one of the best podcasts for travel, and it should be featured among other podcasts in the travel space. Or maybe it's like a really great financial podcast as it's getting closer to tax season, or just sort of get creative on it. The fourth area is cross promotion. This is where we look for sort of the low-hanging fruit when it comes to podcast growth, which is other podcast listeners. And so we're literally doing the research to determine what other podcasts do we think our listeners would also be listening to?
Yeah.
We're creating a big long list, and then we're hitting their websites and finding the right contact information and reaching out to them on why we should work together on cross promoting. Maybe we cross promote by swapping hosts, or maybe we cross promote by, I give you one of my episodes and you drop it into your feed as bonus content to your listeners in exchange for the same thing. Now, a lot of times when you're launching your podcast, you don't have any listeners, right? But maybe you've got a really killer, newsletter list, something of value that you could then go to that podcast and say, if you feature me on your show, I'll then promote your show to our newsletter followers. Or maybe you got a big LinkedIn, LinkedIn, big group of LinkedIn connections.
Totally.
There's no rules to these things. It's all up to creativity. Right. The fifth area is paid. And this is where we're, putting some investment into paid promotion. A lot of times we're promoting the podcast on other podcasts or on podcast players, different platforms. The one area that we don't typically invest in is paid social. We find that it doesn't get a lot of lift. Mostly, I think, because people aren't, just because somebody's, playing around in their Facebook feed doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to want to listen to a podcast right away. And that's really what we want to do, is we want to get them into that space of like, they're already listening to a podcast. Let's get them to subscribe to ours. And then the final area is what we call the more bucket, which we need a better name. But this is where we ask our clients, like, what is the unfair advantage that you have as a brand? And then let's leverage that. So like, if you're a bank, you've got monthly statements that go out, or if you're a nonprofit organization, you've got a really huge list of volunteers that want to like play a role in growing the organization. So reach out to them. So that's kind of the 6 areas that we look at. It's, it takes work and you don't have to do all of that, but you can pull those levers, depending on what, what you want, what you want to do and are capable of doing.
Absolutely. Love that. Wow.
Yeah,
sorry, it's a bit lengthy.
I'm gonna love that. It's amazing the amount of. I see why people go to production agencies like yours, because when you're getting started and you do have some funding behind it to launch with the large brands that you're working with, it's like go to the pros, and that's cool to hear that you guys kind of have figured out your own algorithm and secret sauce.
Exactly.
There's
a process behind
the process exactly.
Which is
awesome, Roger. Well, thank you so much for your time. That was a killer podcast. Awesome. I know we absorbed a ton of information and some really good tactics ourselves that we're going to be able to take away from. Where can our listeners find you, or anyone out there that's interested in working with Jar Audio? Yeah, so check us out at jaraudio.com or visit us on Twitter at jar_audio. You can also visit me personally on Twitter at jar_Roger. And we're also on LinkedIn as well. Hope everyone got something out of this, and I really encourage everyone to play around in the podcast world. It's changing daily, but the content is getting absolutely better by the second, and we're super excited to be a part of it.
Very cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Roger. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to the Biz Bros podcast. Check us out on YouTube and on LinkedIn and Instagram at biz.bros. Thank you so much. And please join us on the next Biz Bros podcast.
See you guys.